You are listening to the podcast The Autistiska Rummet made by Outspace. My name is Sirena Hasselblad. This is our fourth episode, which will be in English. In the pod, we strive to create an autistic space where we can reflect ourselves in each other and build knowledge about who we are. Here, the autistic thinking is the norm. In this episode, you will meet Jenn Layton Annable, who is an activist and a doctoral researcher at the University of Nottingham in the UK. Jenn is researching how persons who are identified as autistic later in life can develop a positive selfhood. During our conversation, Jenn will discuss how terminology, the choice of words, is essential in the process of creating an autistic space. Another important feature in this episode is the unusual sensory differences that Jenn experiences. Besides Jenn Layton Annable, you will hear Hanna Bertilsdotter Rosqvist and me, Sirena. Hanna is an associate professor in sociology and senior lecturer in social work at Södertörn University. I, Sirena, have a PhD in technology but now runs projects in the field of autism. Jenn, Hanna, and I are autists. We define ourselves as autists and see it as an important part of our identity. Before we start, I should mention that Jenn and Hanna, somewhere during our talk, will be referring to an article called Sensory Strangers. It is a chapter in the book Neurodiversity Studies, a New Critical Paradigm, that is published on Routledge. Hanna and Jenn are co-writers of this article. If you are interested in reading it, you may find it either in the book I mentioned or online at ResearchGate.
I've been thinking about autistic spaces quite a lot recently, and two things came to mind that really illustrated the point for me very well in relation to my own work. Obviously, I'm studying my PhD at the moment, and the first one was the phrase that I have adopted, which is describing people as female-bodied autistic persons. The reason why this is really important for me in my work is because I am looking at how socio-cultural perceptions of gender impact on an autistic individual. So although an autistic person may be biologically female, they can have a number of different gender identities, but actually it's how they are perceived externally by others and the society and culture in which they live that causes the impact to be made upon them very negatively if they are perceived as female but they may identify as female but just not wish to subscribe to the gender expectations of being female that their culture expects them to, or they may actively reject it. And in describing a female-bodied autistic person, it was really lovely for me because that is an autistic community originated phrase that we are using to describe an experience and a state of being about ourselves. You know, the fact that we are beginning to use language in a way that we are making decisions about how to describe ourselves is absolutely an autistic space, a metaphorical autistic space, considering that we are described and have been described through diagnostic manuals and very deficit-based language. We're beginning to push back at that. The other example that I found that was, again, really lovely to share was regarding a writing group that I'm participating in for autistic writers in the East Midlands. And the second session was last night, and I have family members who are also autistic, children family members, and the individual in question had come into the room whilst I was participating in the study, and on a couple of occasions, all the participants were autistic. On a couple of occasions, we hadn't referred to one another as autistic. We had referred to ourselves as people like us. And I was able to introduce my son to a group of people like us.
Oh,
Okay.
that's wonderful.
Yeah. So actually, what was really important for me about this was that as a community, the only words and concepts that we have to describe ourselves are those which have originated from medical spaces, from medical dialogues and narratives. And at the moment, that's all we have to describe ourselves. That's all we have to identify one another with. But it seems that as we are beginning to come together as a community and as a culture, as I do believe there is such a thing as autistic culture, we are actually starting to disengage ourselves from that language. And although we haven't reached a point where we have created enough intellectual language, conceptual space for ourselves to actually describe ourselves in our own terms, in unhooking ourselves from being autistic, actually we can start to describe ourselves as people like us, which is a step in the right direction for creating that autistic space for me. So both of those examples have got a huge amount of personal meaning, but the fact that I'm beginning to notice where occurrences like that are popping up in very different contexts in my life is really important to me. And it's really important to me because I can introduce my family member who is also autistic, and give them a sense of community and a sense of belonging that I certainly never had as a child. And there are vast swathes of my adulthood where I didn't have one, but actually he will grow up knowing that there are people like him who live happy lives, productive lives, contributing lives, and actually, we are a force to be reckoned with. So that's an autistic space to me.
I love that. I think that's I think that what we actually are doing in this pod is trying to kind of be this space, but also to develop words of our own.
Yes.
Also to describe ourselves within the space. So we can't describe ourselves outside of this space because then it becomes this kind of in relationship to the medicalized story.
Yeah. And I think one of the difficulties that makes defining an autistic space, or any kind of cultural or even literal space for any kind of marginalized group, is that we have to spend so long pushing back against actually what is suffocating us and has been suffocating us for so long. The narratives that are imposed upon us, that people feel have the right to inflict upon us. So we actually have to sort through the wheat, an expression in English, a wheat from the chaff, which means that we take the rubbish away from the things that are important. And actually, I think that so many people have to spend time as individuals sorting through pretty well probably what's mainly rubbish that's been told about themselves for an entire lifetime. Even having gotten a diagnosis, most of that's rubbish, really, in relation to in relation to actually what we know as autistic people and as a community is real and relevant to our experience, and certainly to most individuals. But actually, having that language, having that confidence is another part of creating an autistic space in one's own sense of self. And this understanding of the self is absolutely crucial to my work. And I think it was absolutely crucial to the group piece of work that we did, where we looked at the concept of sensory strangerhood, the concept of sensory experiences that sat outside of the norm and which were used to vilify and degrade us. My very atypical sensory differences. So for listeners, I have a very high level of what would be described clinically as disordered sensory processing. So I am incredibly sensitive through touch, smell, sight and hearing. And I also process what goes on in my brain very differently as well. And my sensory needs have been pointed out and commented upon with very negative associations in terms of very value-based judgments about me as a person and the kinds of things that I need, that I was asking for. That's really informed the person that I am today. But lots of people haven't had access to the education and the professional support and the resources that I have. So, haven't obviously had the opportunity to benefit in the way that I have.
Can you tell a bit about, because I found which we wrote a little bit about in that text, it was about kind of almost an alternative assessment of your sensory needs, which also was quite recognizing your way of experiencing sensory. It's not just saying it's wrong or it's bad, it's just, okay, how to work with that.
Sure. So, one of the key things that came out of the recommendations from my diagnosis was that I had a huge amount of sensory processing difficulties, which the diagnostician said needed to be investigated and supported me with, but that team didn't have any funding to do that. So I sought funding from an alternative and ended up using money that was provided to me through the public health service, the NHS in England, to actually engage with a private specialist. The assessment I have was something called sensory integration occupational therapy. So occupational therapy is basically helping people to live well, and the individual who I worked with was hugely experienced, but really working mainly with children, because obviously there's a lot more funding for children and young people. The experience that I had was incredibly eye-opening for me, in a very positive way. I realized that some of the experiences that I had as a young person, which had included what might be described as more unorthodox sexual experiences, were actually there to meet my sensory needs. I had been attempting to do the things that my body was telling me naturally made it feel better, but actually in pursuing these practices, they then became another means through which I was vilified and bullied. And also these unorthodox sexual practices, which would fall generally into the kind of sphere of BDSM, bondage, domination, sadomasochism, are also clinically considered to be disordered ways of practicing, sexually, basically. So the whole experience really, it gave me an awful lot of validity about the things that I had done and the person that I was. I've actually got better ways to have my needs met while still being able to look back and reflect on and enjoy the fun, enjoyment and pleasure that I got from my body. And I think that's actually really important as well in exploring myself and pushing myself to the limits that I did. I know what it's capable of physically, and actually how that links into me as a mental entity as well. I've really explored the links between physicality, physical pleasure and pain, and how that impacts on mental as well. So I've got a really, really, really good sense of the person that I am today. And I'm really pleased that I've had all the experiences that I have had and enjoyed.
Because I love that, and I think that's also important if you would bring a message to people who's newly diagnosed, to what is the next step. It's not just say, okay, I need to read all those manuals, I need to read about autism, but I need to read my body and start to understand my body.
Yes.
Not from the perspective of others who's looking upon my body and think it should be otherwise, or expect to do other things, but do how, and sometimes it's like, to go back forwards almost to my childhood to see what did I do actually. Well, I was almost wondering, not wondering, but I was always, I did a lot of things with my different clothers. So I have a wonderful,
with your what?
I don't know what's my
Cardigans, jumpers.
Cardigan,
Yeah.
yeah. It's a special
Cardigan.
texture and a special quality, which I just love. And I have all those kinds of cloths
Yeah.
during my whole life,
Yeah.
but I hadn't worked for them. So it was an ex-partner of mine who said, "Well, you're stimming," and I was like,
Yeah.
"What?" And I really need those words because in that
Yeah.
way I can use them. I can use, oh, I need to stim right now because I'm a bit stressed.
Yeah.
But then I have to understand my sensory needs.
Yes. Yeah. I think it's interesting that you use the analogy of understanding one's body, reading one's body, because my PhD is actually in the field of computer science, and it is the theme of the Centre for Doctoral Training that I'm working in is actually called Making Our Lives in Personal Data. And I would say that autistic people, yes, they need to read their body for what it is in their own language as well, but they also need to read their lives and go back and remember their experiences, relive their experiences, reimagine their experiences. You know, it's not just about replaying them in one's head, it's about understanding what you were in those places and spaces and actually reimagining where you might be if you had had a greater degree of understanding that you have today as an autistic person with that sense of identity, even if it's incredibly new. That process is what I hope to support in the work that I'm doing with female-bodied autistic persons, to look at how the space in which we exist as individuals and a community, where we get pushed in from the expectations that our biological sex imposes on us outside, where the difficulties that we have to cope with as autistic people living in a neurotypical world, on top of dealing with, on top of that, the fact that we are not recognized as such. You know, my background actually is in mental health and mental health recovery, and I'm thinking a lot about is it Foucault who talked about the clinical gaze, and actually we are perceived, you know, this analogy of sight and being seen. We are not seen, we don't exist because we are not seen the in the socio-cultural gaze and the clinical gaze as women who are diagnosable as autistic or with autism, using clinical language. We don't exist because those diagnostic constructs of autism are not yet sufficient to include the particular deficits that we experience in the way that we experience them because of the disabling experience that living in that neurotypical world imposes upon us. But actually having that recognition from a diagnostic concept it's not even only the beginning, it's just totally unacceptable, because it's still treating us as a category. It's still dehumanizing us. It's still not meeting us on our own terms and working with us to understand what it is that we need to live well, to thrive, and to enjoy the rights, our human rights, that we should have access to, but which we don't. I have had many experiences of how that very abstract description in the DSM-5, which is the diagnostic something manual, which the American Psychiatric Association uses with all of its different diagnoses in which autism is included. But how that actually then plays out into the interactions with things like children's social workers, who I've had to encounter as a parent, with mental health staff, when your sensory needs, your communication needs are not met, even though they are supposed to be in law, you end up being treated in a way that traumatizes you, that triggers off all of your autistic difficulties, and then you're in a situation in which you have accusations leveled at you that you're a poor parent, or you are not cooperating with services. It's called non-compliance in mental health practice in the UK. You're not complying with your medical regimen. You are in denial about the fact that you have a mental health problem. You're being uncooperative with professionals, and you wonder why autistic women are dying and are having their children taken off them. And I use autistic women in the sense of female-bodied autistic persons. I just find it horrific that it's going on in the way it is. It feels like we are decades behind where certainly in the UK I'm aware of three kind of movements. So there's the independent living movement, which really promoted the rights of people with physical disabilities, and then there was work around people who live with learning differences, and then there's the mental health survivor movement. And I do feel as an autistic community that we are decades behind other groups of people who live with different physical differences and challenges in recognition of what we are and who we are and what we need.
I think that's maybe also because we are in the crossroads between all those kinds of discourses.
Yes.
We can't really be fitted into one of them, but we always are pushed into. It's either you have a mental illness, or you have a learning difficulty, or you have a physical, but you have to be pushed in either of them. And if you think about the Swedish support system, it's autistic people is part of the learning disabilities groups.
Yes.
In the kind of service sector. So you need to have you have to argue for yourself to get other supports, because mostly they are kind of adapted to people with learning difficulties.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think
you're right. There are elements of all three and some of none in what we are as a group of people. And I think the fact that we are so diverse in how we are and the things that we need also makes it very difficult. I do believe that there will be individual practices of specialism developed for autistic people, neurodiverse people, in the way that there is for mental health and for learning, people living with learning differences as well. But I think we're a long way off that yet.
It is a problem because we are categorized with the help of this diagnosis. Somehow they pinpoint, they find the group, they find us with this diagnose. But then you could say you are not your diagnose. You are a person, so you're not your diagnose. But in our case, it actually has to do with how our brain function, and it is connected with identity.
Yes.
In that way. So we have to categorize ourselves in another way. Of course, we could say people like us, but we need to know who are we.
Yes. I was thinking about this the other day, because in the UK there is language which is that professionals use and prefer, which is described as person first. So a professional would describe me as a woman living with autism, and then there's community language, and many autistic adults prefer to be described as an autistic person. And I was trying to think about how one might negotiate your way through this, because actually I also consider myself to be disabled, but I don't consider myself to have a disability. And when I thought about this, the way I would describe it is that I am an autistic person who is disabled. And by that, I mean that my autistic difference is inherent in me, and that means that because the things that I can do well are not recognized, and the challenges that I have are poorly supported with, I am disabled in society. but I do not have a disability. My autism, being autistic, is not a disability. And that for me is how I am able to negotiate my way through it. I am autistic, I am disabled, but that disabling experience is not an inherent characteristic in me as a person, as an individual. It's created by outside influences and factors which I have a degree of control over, but don't really have as much as I would need to overcome them. And that's how at the moment I'm trying to think about those two things. That kind of meeting those conundrum difficulties, puzzles to work through is really important to me, because I do a lot of work training social workers and mental health staff in the United Kingdom. And I'm finding that I'm increasingly trying to step away from just reproducing this is me, this is sensory differences, and actually start to try and describe in a very direct way some of the ways that they perceive autism, being autistic, and the way I perceive them. Because I think actually, if we are to get the support that we need, which again is part of creating an autistic space, getting that recognition in services of our needs and the fact that we have a right to have them met, is really important. But we need to be able to work with the people and bring them with us on that process and meet them halfway. There's a time for there is a time for activism, there is a time for being harsh and making your point very forcefully, but I don't believe that it's the best way in the first instance. So yeah, autistic spaces. I don't know, do you have any thinking, Hannah, in terms of your ideas of an autistic space in relation to sensory strangerhood? I've done lots of talking today.
I think that right now about the difference in my different kinds of social groups, that when I don't feel disabled when I am in a kind of communication space, which is like this, then it's like I may be autistic, but it's not about it's not a disabled experience, not at all. But in certain spaces, it's definitely a disabled experience. So I think it's really, again, back to my kind of experience of my reading my body and trying to learn about my body signs. If I go with them, I don't have a disability, but if I work against them, I have a disability, because then I crash, I get my meltdowns, shutdowns. So it's really depending on how possible it is for me to be with my body, not against it. And if I'm in such communities, like in autistic spaces, where it's fine to be with your body, you don't have to work against it. It's not the problem.
Absolutely. And I think this is the thing. When I've talked to professionals who are very highly experienced in understanding the capacity that autistic people have to cope with sensory input, and the degree of awareness that we have on it, and the lack of ability to block it out, I've been told by a number of different people that if you stuck a neurotypical person with typical sensory processing and responsiveness in my body, they would probably be committed to a mental hospital within a day, because if you took the sensory responsiveness that they were used to and then put it into what I have to cope with, they just wouldn't be able to do it. But all they see still, this is something about thresholds here. And actually, I'm beginning to feel that being autistic in relation to other neurotypes is actually about a sense of thresholds and capacity. When I describe sensory experiences to neurotypical people, I've started to use sensory analogies. So when I talk about to mental health staff and say, well, you might have to sit down and do a morning's worth of assessments, but imagine you're not in your quiet office with your colleagues humming past. You've got to do them your desk is next to the speaker at Glastonbury. Yeah. And and you have to conduct your assessments, and you have to hear everything that the person is saying, and you have to be polite and pleasant and maintain calm. And no, you don't get a break. Okay? And I said, so you might do it for, the first one's 20 minutes, and you get through and you grit your teeth. And then you decide, right, I need to get a break. I need to get away from this situation. And you leave your desk and you walk off, and somebody turns around and says, no, we're terribly sorry. You've got to go back. You've got to do it next to the speaker. You can't leave. Okay. So you go back to your desk and you do another one, but actually you're beginning to feel very stressed now, and you're right, I've got to leave. But you get it to leave, and the same person says, no, you can't leave. And I say, ultimately, after probably 2 to 3 hours, you will have no capacity left to be polite. You will not even have capacity left to do your job. And if that person tells you that you've got to go back and sit at that desk again, ultimately you will take a swing at them, get away from the noise, and they'll sit there and they say, okay, we get it now. Yeah. And using that analogy of putting things very much in and the equivalent, everybody's been in a really noisy environment, but it's about describing that thresholds. And it's often a bit of a light bulb moment, a light bulb moment, a moment of epiphany, a moment of realization. Sorry, I tend to use metaphors quite a bit as well, for people who don't often think about the difficulties that neurodiverse and autistic people have in doing the things that they find effortless.
Because also because when I have my meltdown sometimes when I have a kind of heated argument with a partner, and as in the kind of neurotypical normal way is supposed to be able, you're supposed to be able to endure that argument, because if you're not a grown-up person. You're just moving, you're just running away.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it's like, yes, but all these kinds of emotional impacts or stimulus this augmentation is getting to me. It's not just what we are talking about, but it's all this kind of emotional flow which is just getting into my body. And soon I will start crying, not because we have a very harsh argument. It's not about that, but it's just getting too much.
Yeah.
And then it's like, oh, you're not an adult person. Can't you just be here and discuss with me what we have to discuss, because we are grown-up persons? So I think that's also the kind of, at least for me, to kind of to know that I might not be able to be in this kind of heated argument for so long time as I'm supposed to be.
Yeah.
And to kind of be able to say that I'm sorry, we can just have this heated argument for a while, and then we have to have a break. It's like, but I'm mad at you. Yes, but we can't continue to have this heated argument because I can't stand it.
Yeah. It's going to make me ill. I think that part of unpicking what we need as a community and as individuals is a challenge. One of the things I've become very aware of, which I hadn't probably up until about 18 months ago, was the experience of people who really struggle with demands placed upon them. It's not something that I personally find very difficult, but I have people who I know who I have made very value-based judgments around about, as you just said, Hannah, why can't you tidy up after yourself? Why can't you remember to shut the cupboard? Why can't you hang a towel up? Why? And I've been very guilty of making the same value-based judgments about others as the kind of thing that you have just described. And part of the experience of learning what we are and who we are is about understanding the dimensions of our experience. And by that I mean that pathological demand avoidance is a fairly recent inclusion to what's considered to be the autistic spectrum. And the people I'm talking about have a huge amount of struggles in this particular area. That's kind of like their main area of challenge. But in learning about them, I have had to become very humble about my attitude towards them. it's called eating humble pie in England. You have to develop a sense of humility, and I was very ashamed about the way that I had treated these people. But actually, I learned about that feeling that I had when I was getting overwhelmed, which I'm sure it's the one that you probably have as well, the feeling of needing to run away, the feeling of I just want to be left alone, is demand avoidance. And I had never had a word for that before.
Because also I find this demand avoidance thing is so I find it very hard to kind of identify it because it sounds like you're not a person who's taking responsibilities. I just find that I can take a responsibility for myself and the kind of heated diet load, but I just can't do it in a big thug. I need to kind of make it in small pieces because if I do it if I do the whole kind of heated argument in one thug, I will kind of get my meltdowns in the middle because I can't just keep on getting it. So I think it's also about trying to think about alternative ways of doing arguments that
Yes.
could be more inclusive. So it's hard to say to an angry person that can we do this in a kind of inclusive way? I understand that you're mad at me and I understand that I kind of made you mad, but I want to make this right. And if we are going to do this right, I need to be able to be included.
Yes.
We can't just argue in a kind of normal, never typical way.
Yes.
We have to do it in my way, which could be more okay. We have to take it in 15 minutes, thugs.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we can come back, and sooner or later we have been in an agreement, and we can understand. I will say sorry to you, or whatever, and we'll be fine.
Yeah. But as well, I wonder how much as autistic people, particularly if the people that you are fighting with are also autistic, how much of the argument could be avoided if we weren't dealing with the things that society tells us that we should or could be doing. And by that I mean that in reading the kind of scientific literature about masking, if you go back about 8 years, there were some suggestions that masking was kind of an inherent ability for us to socialize ourselves, and that maybe masking might be encouraged. It might be something that services could teach us to do better. But actually, like, a lot of the latest research around masking is that it's as much of a sociological manifestation as much of as a psychological one, in response to not being able to perform, because it is about performing and performance, and not being able to perform in the way that is expected of us. And I kind of return to the kind of demand avoidance thing. There's a lot of knowledge about the fact that people tend to blame other people and get very argumentative. But if you're in a situation where somebody's come along and said, "Oh, why have you done that?" You're looking for something. Well, it's right there. Haven't you looked properly for it? Why can't you look properly for it? You always do this. It's really natural. You can understand why somebody who struggles with the demand of looking for something in a busy environment, when that intersects with, sensory difficulties in a highly detailed, visually complex environment, they will, that's a very understandable response to being asked, well, why do you do that? Why do you always have issues with stuff like that? But for me, actually, just taking a step back and saying, look, it's okay. We found it. There's no need. I'm not blaming you. I accept that you struggle with that. I came to help. We found it. Just put it down. Do you know what I mean? So how much of the arguments that we have are because of the things that we think we're supposed to do that we don't actually enjoy doing and which hurt us anyway? How many times as autistic people have we sat performing with body language and making eye contact and stuff like that, when actually we don't have to? I don't like making eye contact with you. You don't like making eye contact with me. Let's just sit and talk each other, But we have had this expectation. It's so ingrained into us. We can't put it down.
But I think that also needs us to learn new methods. As we have to say to each other, I don't like to look in your eyes. I know that you don't like it either. We don't have to, because then now you're open again a new space for communication,
Yes,
where it's
absolutely.
fine to sit beside each other on a bench and
Yeah.
talk, and we'll be having an intense discussion, but we won't touch each other and we won't look at each other.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I found really fascinating about the current coronavirus pandemic, certainly in the UK, and I don't know how this might have, if something similar happened in Sweden, but because it was so quiet for about 3 months, there was no noise from industry, there was no noise from cars, there was no noise whatsoever. And right across England and the United Kingdom, I saw posts from people saying, I didn't know I could feel this calm. I didn't know I could feel this unstressed, because all of the stuff that I get imposed upon me, not even through people being rude or intrusive, but just because of living in a society where there's aeroplanes and factories and people playing loud music, is just part of the background pressure. And I'm obviously so sad and distressed about the situation in the world at the moment and the terrible costs to life. However, I hope that the benefits of accessibility and different ways of thinking can be adopted in more of the long term.
And you've been listening to the podcast The Autistiska Rummet. In this episode, you heard Jenn Layton Annable, Hanna Bertilsdotter Rosqvist, and me, Sirena Hasselblad. Dennis Hansson was responsible for editing. The podcast has its background in our book Autism inifrån, speglingar av ett autistiskt vi. In English, Autism from Within, Reflections of an Autistic Us. So far only available in Swedish. More info on our website outspace.se. The music in the podcast is an interpretation of a folk song from the Faroe Islands about the seal people, a special arrangement by Åsa Lindström. Åsa also sings with Eva Robbins and Carolyn Corbin.